Fellas, what if the UFC created an 8-man BMF tournament? Now, obviously, the BMF champion Max Holloway is going to be taking on Ilia Topuria this weekend. The BMF belt isn't for grabs. And I've been seeing a lot of posts recently, like theoretical matchup between like 8 different BMFs in like a tournament format style from completely different people. And it's kind of got me thinking, what if the UFC did an 8-man BMF tournament? So I've created like a tournament format with different kind of fighters who would qualify for a BMF to find out who would win out of all these fighters and to see how the tournament will go. Now, there are some rules for this tournament. The first rule is you must obviously qualify for a BMF. Now, in my opinion, a BMF, without trying to sound all corny and everything, it's someone that's anytime, anywhere, any place. Someone that's actually willing to scrap and a fun fighter. So, for example, Colby Covington is a prime example of someone who wouldn't qualify for a BMF. But then you've got Max Holloway, who is a prime example of somebody who would qualify. The second one is, they must be able to fight around 155. I'm sure there's people that might qualify for this tournament based on the BMF rules. But if they can't make 155, obviously they can't make it to the tournament because this is strictly like a 155 tournament. And they must be an active member of the UFC roster. So the likes of Nate Diaz, Jorge Masvidal, Conor McGregor, these guys ain't going to make it to the tournament because they just ain't active. Diaz hasn't fought in the octagon for 769 days. Masvidal's been out for 559 days and McGregor's been out for over 1,000 days. So we'll start off with the first tournament placement that I've chosen. Now, for the first fighter in the tournament, I've gone with Dustin Poirier. I think Dustin Poirier is definitely able to make it to the BMF tournament. I mean, he's never in a boring fight. He fits all of those categories. The dude has been in so many scraps in his time. The likes of Dan Hooker, Justin Gaethje, the recent fights with, guys like Chandler and BSD and Makachev. He's never in a boring fight. He's Dustin Poirier, and he's a BMF. I mean, he didn't have to fight Benoit Saint-Denis when Benoit Saint-Denis was on the come up, and he did, and he put him to sleep. Faced Islam Makhachev, the toughest guy in the UFC, the best guy in the UFC, and went 5 rounds with him. Obviously got finished in the 5th, but still put up a dogfight. The dude is just an absolute monster. And on top of that, before, he's fought for the BMF belt before. Okay, he might have not won against Justin Gaethje, but the fact that he's been able to fight for it before tells me that he's able to qualify, and I'm going to put him in the first category. The second one, I'm going to go with Alexander Volkanovski. I've heard a few people say that Alexander Volkanovski shouldn't be able to qualify because he's a bit of a decision machine and he weren't really able to finish people in his prime. Have you seen the faces of people after they've done fighting Volkanovski? Volkanovski, he absolutely butchers people. He makes people's faces look like they've just been in some sort of car accident. He's an absolute beast. I mean, fighting Max Holloway and beating him 3 times, to do that to Max Holloway, to go out there against Islam Makhachev, pound for pound #1 in the world, and nearly finish him in that last round. A couple months later, goes out there against the interim champion Yair Rodriguez and finishes him. A couple months later, on like 10 days' notice, fights Makhachev, the toughest guy in the UFC again, on 10 days' notice, gets knocked out, fair enough, just to come back a few months later and face the next big contender in Ilia Topuria. Alexander Volkanovski, in my opinion, definitely gets that second spot. The third spot in the tournament, I'm going to give it to Dan Hooker. Yeah, I think Dan Hooker definitely deserves it as well if you look at the lightweight. I mean, again, this dude has been involved in so many scraps. That war that he had with Dustin Poirier, one of the best fights of the year when he fought Poirier. Even his last couple of fights, that war with Jalen Turner at UFC 290, the recent fight with Gamrot, which was a stylistic problem for Dan Hooker, and he made it an absolute scrap. And there's just been so many good fights of Dan Hooker's career. It's either him getting finished early, him finishing with someone else early, and if it's not that, it's an absolute scrap across 5 rounds. He's very rarely in a boring fight, if he ever is. So I'm going to put Dan Hooker in the tournament too. Then I'm going to go with Charles Oliveira. Charles Oliveira might be the most exciting, or at least one of the most exciting fighters in the UFC. Nearly got finished against Michael Chandler in that first round, came back and finished him in the second. Got dropped by Dustin Poirier in that first round, finished him in the second. Missed weight against Justin Gaethje by half a pound, meaning that the belt was no longer on the line. Everyone was saying he was going to lose his motivation. He even got dropped like multiple times in that first round against Gaethje, just to then finish him later on in that first round. He fought Beneil Dariush when Beneil Dariush was on this big winning streak, and he ends up finishing Beneil Dariush as well. And he's fought so many people in the top 10 of the lightweight division. The only people he hasn't fought in the top 10 of the lightweight division is Dan Hooker, Fiziev, and Gamrot. So I think Charles Oliveira can definitely qualify for a BMF. Next up on the tournament, I'm going to go with Michael Chandler. When you combine the words explosive, scrappy, dangerous, monster, brawler, entertaining, you get Michael Chandler. He is literally like, if you was to try and create like a fun fighter in a lab, Michael Chandler would be that guy. Kicks off his UFC career by knocking out Dan Hooker. Then he takes 2 losses in very close fights. Obviously goes against Charles Oliveira, nearly finishes him in the first and then gets finished in the second. Has an absolute war with Justin Gaethje, back and forth, one of the best fights of the year. Then he sends Tony Ferguson to the Shadow Realm, and then he has that fight with Dustin Poirier where again he nearly finished Dustin Poirier, and then he ends up getting finished later on in that fight. But the point is, Michael Chandler's never in a boring fight, and a lot of people have been wanting to see Michael Chandler compete for the BMF, so I'm going to add him in the tournament too. The next one is Max Holloway. I mean, it goes without saying really, he is the current BMF champion of the world. That fight with Justin Gaethje where he was winning the fight and he points in the middle and just starts throwing down, and he's always just just been one of the best, man. Like, he fought Khabib on short notice in a different weight class when he didn't have to do that. Same with Dustin Poirier. Well, he didn't actually get to the fight with Khabib, but the Poirier fight did happen, and he fought on short notice in that. And look at his resume as well. The amount of people, the amount of killers that Max Holloway has fought, and not only just fought, but he's beaten so many as well. I can't even read off everyone in his resume because he's fought so many people in his UFC career. He's a scrapper. He's always been known for, you know, doing the iconic pointing in the middle and throwing down. He doesn't give a shit every single time. Whether it's him going out there and absolutely splattering opponents or it's him getting splattered like he did against Alexander Volkanovski, he's never in a boring fight, and he will do everything in his power to make it a good fight. And I think out of all the BMFs we've had in the UFC so far, he's definitely the best and the most deserving one. So it goes without saying Max Holloway in this tournament. Next up on the tournament, I'm going to go with Justin Gaethje. I think Justin Gaethje deserves it as well. I mean, he is a former BMF champion before the fight with Max Holloway. He's the only BMF champion so far to compete for the belt twice, and I just feel like he's like, if you were to put the word carnage into a human being, Justin Gaethje would be that fighter. It's just carnage every single time. I mean, he's so dangerous, but he's also so vulnerable at the same time. So every single time he fights, it's always like back and forth. It doesn't matter who he's fighting, he will make it a back and forth fight. I remember when he fought Eddie Alvarez, went for a takedown, and his body literally rejected the takedown because he just wanted to stand and bang. This dude is the definition of carnage, never in a boring fight, so dangerous, but also eligible to get him finished. And I feel like Justin Gaethje might be one of the most exciting fighters in the UFC. And finally on the spot, I'm going to go with Ilia Topuria. I think Ilia Topuria in this tournament can really fuck things up in this tournament. I mean, just look at his past couple of fights. He hasn't had the longest UFC career like the rest of them, but knocking out Alexander Volkanovski, the best featherweight, goes out there before that and butchers, absolutely batters Josh Emmett. Before that, beats undefeated Bryce Mitchell. You know, before that, a couple of fights before that, destroys Jai Herbert, sends him to the Shadow Realm. I feel like if you had Topuria in this tournament, it would just make it way better as well. It would just be more bloody. It would just be more violent. So these are the people who are going to qualify for the BMF tournament, which will make the first matchup Dustin Poirier against Alexander Volkanovski. Poirier against Volkanovski. Now, if you'd have asked me this a few years ago, I probably would have said Alexander Volkanovski. When Volkanovski was, you know, battering the likes of Max Holloway, he had that very, very close fight with Islam Makhachev and then finished Yair Rodriguez. When Volk was in his prime, I would have probably favoured Volkanovski to beat Dustin Poirier, especially how he looked at the 155 division against Islam Makhachev. But if you ask me this nowadays, I mean, Volkanovski's been KO'd in his last two fights. And Dustin Poirier, in his last two fights, he's had a very, no, I'm not going to say it wasn't a close fight, but he went 5 rounds and had a scrap with Makhachev, and he knocked out Benoit Saint-Denis. And I think this is a very bad matchup for Alexander Volkanovski. And the good thing about this matchup as well is when you categorize the best boxers in the UFC, there's a lot of different names. Max Holloway and Topuria, some of the best boxers in the UFC. Volkanovski's already fought both of them. Petr Yan's a bantamweight, which leaves like Dustin Poirier as like one of the best boxers in the UFC that Volkanovski hasn't fought. And I think this could be such a good matchup for him as well. And the reason I'm going with Dustin Poirier to win this fight is because I feel like Volkanovski, as of right now, you want him to face a fight where there's not really much KO threat. Somebody like Aljamain Sterling or Movsar where he doesn't really have the threat of getting chinned. He has the threat of getting chinned against Dustin Poirier. Poirier, like I said before, is one of the best boxers in the lightweight division. So I'm going to say that Dustin Poirier beats Alexander Volkanovski as of right now. From what I've seen in their past couple of fights, I'm leaning towards Poirier winning by some sort of finish within the time frame and progressing it onto the tournament. And then the next fight would be Dan Hooker versus Charles Oliveira. I actually thought this fight should have happened after UFC 305. Obviously, Oliveira's now booked against Michael Chandler, but they're both in the top 5. Oliveira's coming off a loss. Dan Hooker's coming off 3 wins. I feel like this would have been the perfect fight to make before Oliveira versus Chandler got booked. But I feel like you've just got to go with Charles Oliveira to win this fight. I mean, he's finished Dustin Poirier, he's finished Justin Gaethje, he's finished Dariush, he's finished Justin Gaethje as well. He's finished so many different fights. And on top of that, you look at Charles Oliveira in the nightmare matchups. It tends to be guys like Makhachev or Sarukian, like very high-level wrestlers. And he tends to do well against the scrappy styles like the Gaethjes, Chandlers, and Poiriers, which Dan Hooker kind of fits into. So even though I think this will be a bloody fight and an absolute scrap, I've got to go with Charles Oliveira beating Dan Hooker. I just think he's one of the best in the world. The next fight would be Michael Chandler versus Max Holloway. A fight that I think this fight was actually talked about after Holloway beat Justin Gaethje, but Holloway rightfully rejected the fight to claim his belt in the featherweight division to take the fight with Dustin Poirier. But I think this would be such an interesting fight. You've got the technique of Max Holloway versus the explosive brawliness of Justin Gaethje. You've got the striking edge to Max Holloway versus the grappling edge to Michael Chandler. It's just such a good fight. Like the clash of styles between the two of them would be so interesting. And I just think it'll be so good. I would definitely favour Max Holloway to win this fight. I mean, Michael Chandler has only won 2 fights in the UFC. He beat Dan Hooker and he beat Tony Ferguson, whereas Max Holloway, you look at his past couple of fights, I mean, he's had a career-best performance against Justin Gaethje when he moved to the lightweight division and absolutely splattered Justin Gaethje, something that Michael Chandler couldn't do. And on top of that, look at the activity of both of them as well. Since 2021, Holloway's fought 4 times, whereas Chandler's only fought twice and won once, so I think this would be an absolute, I just think this would be a great fight stylistically, but I've got to go with Max Holloway to beat Michael Chandler. And then the final fight in the first bracket would be Justin Gaethje versus Ilia Topuria. I heard a lot of people talking about this matchup as well, previous to Topuria facing Volkanovski, and a lot of people were favouring Gaethje to win this fight, and I think it would be a really good fight because you've got Justin Gaethje who, like I said, he just doesn't stop throwing. He's very durable to getting finished, but he's also so dangerous as well. He is the human definition of, he is the definition of the word carnage. And on top of that, he's shocked a lot of people before as well. He was the underdog, I'm pretty sure, going into that fight with Dustin Poirier, where he finished Poirier. He beat an up-and-coming striker in Rafael Fiziev. I feel like if there's anyone that's going to shock the world in the lightweight division against Ilia Topuria, Justin Gaethje could be that guy, but I feel like I've just got to go with Ilia Topuria winning this fight. I mean, we saw in that fight with Josh Emmett how easily he outclassed Josh Emmett, and obviously the main fight with Volkanovski, where he chins the best featherweight in the world, the guy who's never been beaten in the featherweight division. I feel like you've just kind of got to go with him to win this fight, and I feel like it kind of matters when the fight ends. I feel like if I'm going to favour Topuria to win, it's got to be early because most of his finishes or most of his fights don't make it past the first or the second round. But if it's later on in the fight, that's where you kind of want to favour Justin Gaethje because the guy's always going to be there pressuring you with his, his heavy, just chaotic striking style. So I think this would be a really good fight. But if I had to pick right now, I've got to go with Ilia Topuria by some sort of knockout in the early rounds, just because of how dangerous Topuria is and how vulnerable Justin Gaethje is, which makes the next fight Dustin Poirier versus Charles Oliveira. Now, obviously, we have seen this fight before, and it was for the lightweight belt a couple of years ago. Dustin Poirier had some success on the feet early on in the fight, but most of the fight was just Oliveira out-grappling Poirier until eventually he was able to latch up a submission. Now, they've both gone 2-2 since that fight. Obviously, Charles Oliveira's lost to Sarukian, lost to Makhachev, beat Dariush and beat Gaethje, and Poirier's also lost to Makhachev, lost to Gaethje, but beat BSD and beat Chandler. So they're both 2-2. But like I said before, if there's a matchup that's going to be difficult for Charles Oliveira, it's going to be a heavy grappling and a heavy wrestling style like Islam Makhachev or Sarukian. And I just don't really know why I'd pick necessarily Dustin Poirier to beat him this time around. On top of that, you can kind of argue that, I mean, if you are a Poirier fan and you think Poirier is going to win, you can argue that he's been a little bit more active because since 2022 he has fought more times than Charles Oliveira has. But I don't understand why you wouldn't really go for Oliveira to win this fight. They both seem like they've improved somewhat since their first fight. I mean, listen, I'm not trying to make excuses or anything right now, but even against Benoit Saint-Denis, Dustin Poirier got his back taken by BST. I don't know why the best submission artist in the UFC who has done that before to Dustin Poirier wouldn't be able to do it again. So I'm going to say that Charles Oliveira gets past Dustin Poirier, makes it into the final of the tournament. And then the next fight is going to be Max Holloway versus Ilia Topuria. Now, like I said at the beginning of the video, they're going to be taking each other on this week, so maybe this is going to edge really badly because we're going to find out the result this week, which I can't wait for, by the way. And I feel like what makes this fight so intriguing is because they're both just looking so good recently. You've got Ilia Topuria, the guy who knocked out the best featherweight in the world and stopped the reign of Alexander Volkanovski, the same guy that beat Max Holloway on 3 different occasions. He's also undefeated as Topuria. He's never been beaten before. He's also an extremely vicious striker, and he can grapple as well. He's got the grappling in his back pocket as well. And you've got Max Holloway, who's coming off one of the career best performances, the best knockout of the year against Justin Gaethje. And before that, he beat 2 contenders in Korean Zombie and Arnold Allen. And he's a former champion as well. And he's been around the featherweight division for so long and beaten so many top names. It's a really difficult fight to pick. I'm not going to do a full prediction now. I'll do that in a couple of days when I predict UFC 308. But the way that they've been leading up to fight week, the confidence of Topuria, and the way it just seems like Topuria is here to stay now. I just can't imagine, I'm not saying it's impossible, but I just can't imagine Topuria losing in the UFC anytime soon. I feel like I've got to go and lean towards Ilia Topuria winning this fight. So I'm going to say that Topuria makes it to the final against Charles Oliveira. And then the final of the BMF tournament will be Ilia Topuria versus Charles Oliveira, which I genuinely can't pick because, I mean, I've already said before why. Ilia Topuria, he's not had the longest resume, but the people that he's beaten, Josh Emmett and specifically Alexander Volkanovski, he's looked great against. Now, the thing that makes this strange is because, like I've said multiple times, Oliveira, the difficult fight tends to be these very heavy wrestling styles like Makhachev versus Sarukian, but Topuria doesn't really fit into that category, but at the same time, he doesn't really fit into the category of like one of these extreme brawlers like a Gaethje, Chandler, or Poirier, because he's dangerous, but he's also very calculated, and on top of that, he's got the grappling in the back pocket as well. I really don't know who to pick in this fight. It's an extremely tough one to call in the 155 division. So tough that I had to leave it to you lot. You lot decided that you think Charles Oliveira wins this fight by a 60-40 poll that I did on my YouTube channel. So it looks like the winner of the BMF tournament is going to be Charles Oliveira, which makes sense because I feel like Charles Oliveira could be like the ultimate BMF because he's exciting. He's one of these anytime, anywhere, any place fighters. Like, he fits the criteria of a BMF, but on top of that, he is the best out of all of them. Like, he is one of the best lightweights in the world, top 3 best lightweights in the world right now. So that would be what would happen if the UFC was to theoretically do an 8-man BMF tournament, or at least that is what would happen in my opinion. Obviously, the matchmaking could be different. People could start against different fighters, but let me know your thoughts on this tournament. If you agree, disagree, thank you for watching.